All right, what's going on? Kyle Welcher here. We're out here fishing right now and been throwing a ton of jigs today. Been throwing a swim jig a little bit, flipping around a jig a little bit. And I just wanted to kind of take a second and run through kind of the properties that make me want to pick a certain jig for a certain situation. You know, a jig has been one of the baits that for years and years and years continues to catch really big fish. I mean, there's been people won tournaments on jigs 25, 30 years ago, and people are still winning tournaments on jigs right now. So I really do believe that most jigs get about the same amount of bites. Like as far as the colors, the profile, the trailer you use, a lot of that stuff kind of is very similar whenever you go from jig to jig and across brands and all kinds of different things like that. I feel like most jigs will actually get close to the same amount of bites, but certain jigs are going to get in the cover a little bit better, out of the cover a little bit better. They're going to land more fish. They're going to, hook more fish whenever the fish are shallow. Some jigs will hook more fish better when the fish are deep, when the fish are real deep. So I have kind of simplified it down to a couple of jigs that I have a ton of confidence in, or a handful of jigs that I have a ton of confidence in, and I'm gonna tell you why I like to pick every jig for the certain scenario. So number one for me, this is one of the most overlooked things in jig fishing, and that is gonna be your hook gap. So you can see right here, I've got an untamed tackle ace jig right here, and you can see the actual point of the hook sticks up 1/4 of an inch higher than the actual line tie that's on the jig. And I'll get my swim jig like that. It's almost, this one actually has a little bit bigger gap, because on the swim jig I throw it shallower. You need a little bit bigger gap the shallower you are, because those fish are at a more like slider angle towards you, so it's easier to blow their mouth open, so you need a bigger gap. So you can see the hook point is like 1/4 inch, maybe even closer to a 1/2 inch higher than the line tie. And what that's going to do is that's going to give you no obstruction whenever you set the hook. That hook is just going to have to dig into that fish's mouth, and you're going to hook more fish that way. If you have a line tie that's up in front of the point of the hook, it's just going to cause you problems. It's just going to get in the way whenever you're setting the hook on those fish. But that's one of the biggest things, and it's the more important the shallower you are, because if you're super deep, you're fishing 25 foot deep, you're setting the hook at such an upward angle that it's not going to make that big of a difference. But if you're setting the hook super shallow, like bed fishing or anything like that, you have to have that really, really good hook gap to make sure that you land a lot of those fish. A lot of people that use other types of jigs, they'll set the hook on a fish, get him out from under the dock, the fish will come up and first jump, they'll lose that fish, and that's because that hook doesn't have the correct hook gap. So we're going to kind of go through head shapes and stuff like that. Everybody knows a football head jig. I don't throw those a ton, but everybody knows they come through rock really well, they stand up good, they don't get hung in the small little cracks and crevices, because the way that head is actually shaped, it is a really efficient way to fish rubble rock or any kind of big rock. It's the most efficient jig to fish on that, because the head is going to give you the best bottom contact and also not fall in those little cracks. But I don't throw that jig too much. I'm usually using a jig for flipping and swimming it and then casting and skipping it. So first we'll go back to the ace jig like this. This jig is very smooth on the bottom, and it has a very wide surface. And what this is going to do, we wanted the smoothest, widest surface to transition straight from the back of the head straight to the trailer. And this is a jig that I skip a ton. This is like my dock jig that I use the most out of any jig. This is the one that I keep tied on all the time. And we wanted that smooth transition from a wide back of the head down here to a wide spot on the trailer, so that you could, whenever you skip, you don't get any weird hops or rolls. It's a very smooth transition down. We also used a thinner cut skirt, and that thinner cut skirt has less resistance on the water, and it actually also helps it skip a little bit better. So that's why we put these types of properties into this jig, so it would be a really good skipping jig. And it doesn't have to be docks. It could be, skipping under overhang bushes and all that type of stuff. But that's the properties that I look for whenever I'm trying to use a skipping jig. And like I said, you also have to have that hook gap. A lot of people have disagreeing opinions as far as the weed guard goes. I like a little bit stiffer weed guard. I like a pretty stiff weed guard. I feel like I can get a razor blade and trim some of that out if I need to make it a little bit lighter. But for the most part, I use a 7'3" medium heavy, a pretty stout rod, and 20-pound fluorocarbon. I set the hook pretty hard. I don't have any problems hooking fish with that stiffer weed guard. Everybody has a different opinion on that. I would say go the lightest you could possibly go until you start getting hung up too much. And the cover that I throw this in, I like to have a little bit stronger weed guard. So that's the properties I look for in the skipping jig. That's what makes that jig to me a really good skipping jig. Now, this right here is a swim jig. This is the Untamed Tackle Apex swim jig. You can see the line tie on this jig is actually turned this way, instead of being a cross eye, it's actually an inline line tie. What that does is it keeps everything on the jig just more streamlined. And what that's going to do is whenever you're reeling that bait, there's going to be less, it's going to have better hydrodynamics, which means that it's going to have less like water resistance that's going to make this bait move unnaturally. Everything's going to be super in line. It's going to come through the water really efficiently. It's going to come through grass, wood, all that type of stuff, and it's going to come through at the most natural angle at all times, and that's going to make you get, you know, hung up way less often. So this jig has almost like a triangular shaped head. It's a lot more fancy than that, a lot more time into it, but it's like a triangular shaped head that actually kind of parts the cover and comes through really, really nicely. This one happens to be a 5/16 ounce. For the swim jig that I like doing, I like fishing it really shallow. The 5/16 ounce is the sweet spot to me for keeping that bait so I can work it really fast and not blow it out of the water, and then still keeping that bait up shallow enough where I feel like those fish are, you know, almost biting it like a topwater bait. So that's what the swim jig, you know, head design is all about, is parting all the cover and stuff like that. Another really important thing is, like I said about the other jig, I like a really stiff weed guard, but I like for it to have a very small gap between the weed guard and then the point of the hook. So I want it to be hard to compress, but you don't have to compress it very far. And what that does is it just makes that weed guard not have to bend super far down before you can actually get to the point of the hook. And another thing is, nothing can get in this way to get you hung up. So a lot of times you get hung on branches or whatever, and the branch will actually be around your hook like this, and you'll be like, how did it even get in there? And a lot of times it went in there because your weed guard angle is too high in between the weed guard and the hook point. So you want to make sure that's as closed off as possible without you still getting hung too often. So that's another reason that I beef up the, you know, weed guard on the jigs that I throw. So you can see this is the Ace, this is the rod that I throw it on. This is just a little crawl color that I have. I usually am going to throw this jig, like I said a while ago, on a 7.3 medium heavy extra fast, a very fast gear ratio reel. The only jig that I ever throw on a slower gear ratio reel is going to be a vibrating jig. Almost always I'm going to have these on an 8-to-1. Even the swim jig, I'm going to have it on an 8-to-1. That's just what I always use. So that's the setup that I use. 7.3 just because that's what's comfortable to me. We went through the swim jig, we went through the all-around casting, compact, skipping, flipping, everything jig, and then now I'm going to show y'all the Untamed Tackle eviction jig. So you can see this has a very unique head shape, and this is just like what I was saying earlier. It still looks very similar like a jig, like they all look very, very similar, but this head shape is going to provide some benefits in certain applications. If you're flipping around milfoil, hydrilla, any type of grass, any type of laydown, this is not a very good rock jig. It's not a jig that you want to pick up around rock, even though you can catch them off rock, but it's going to be a penetrating cover type of a jig. You can see how this head shape is actually narrower at the base, and then it gets a little bit fatter up here by the line tie. What that does is it gives you a very extreme weight forward on the jig, and that jig is going to kind of penetrate through cover, punch through grass, all that type of stuff more efficiently, because where the weight is going to really pull that jig down. Now, the only reason that's going to get you more bites because you can get this bait in and out of cover more efficiently. So I just wanted to kind of take some time and go through the properties of a lot of these jigs. All these jigs have, you know, 4 or 5 aught. You know, like the Ace has the smallest hook, and it's still got a 4 aught Gamakatsu hook in it. That's another really important thing for me, is I want to make sure I have a hook that will absolutely not flex if you're throwing on braid, or if you're throwing on really high fluorocarbon. I want to make sure I have some kind of a really good gauge wire hook, and also super sharp. So those are kind of the properties that make me pick a certain jig in a certain scenario. Hope y'all implement that and be a little more efficient jig fisher.